The Easter rebels understood the importance of propaganda and were determined to get word of the uprising out to the outside world. O'Kelly was therefore instructed by Joseph Plunkett to take a group of men from the post office to seize the School of Wireless Telegraphy at the corner of Sackville and Abbey Streets. He was ordered to secure the building and make operational a wireless transmitter that had been decommissioned by British authorities at the outset of the Great War. Led by O'Kelly, a group of volunteers, including the well-known Abbey actor Arthur Shields, electrician Sean O'Connor, and Marconi operator David Burke, broke into the school and began to try and resuscitate a 1.5 kilowatt ship-to-ship radio transmitter. While Burke worked on the radio, O'Kelly and his men made their way to the roof of the building where they struggled to erect an aerial. Sniper fire from British positions at Trinity College and the Tivoli Theatre grew intense, killing a volunteer on an adjacent building and forcing the men to withdraw from the roof. The aerial was eventually erected under cover of darkness, and O'Kelly sent word to the General Post Office that the transmitter was now operational. Years later, he was interviewed by the Bureau of Military History and explained, quote, "On reporting to HQ that the transmitting apparatus was operating, a message was sent over by James Connolly for broadcast transmission. Because the receiving apparatus could not be got to operate correctly, it was not possible to get in direct touch with any station or ship. But the message was sent out on the normal commercial wavelength in the hope that some ship would receive it and relay it as interesting news. The message announced the proclamation of an Irish Republic and the taking over of the city by the Irish Republican Army. Heavy shell fire from the gunboat Helga, positioned on the Liffey, eventually forced O'Kelly and his men to withdraw from the wireless school. They decided to take the transmitter with them in the hope that it might be used again. The men struggled down narrow stairs and through back alleys under gunfire to get the bulky equipment back to the General Post Office. However, the GPO-2 was under heavy shelling, and the transmitter was abandoned and destroyed in the fire that consumed the building. A couple of slides here, of course, the Irish Republican flag. And this is O'Kelly again, who was interviewed by the Bureau of Military History and gave his account of the first broadcast. In his classic study, Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian guru of media studies, defines the rebels' desperate transmission as the world's first broadcast. He notes that by 1916, wireless was already being used in the maritime world as ship-to-shore telegraph, but argued, quote, "The rebels used a ship's wireless to make not a point-to-point message, but a diffused broadcast in the hope of getting word out to ships that would relay the story to the American press." Although the insurgents failed in their efforts to thwart British censorship and inform the world of their rising, broadcasting, as we know it today, was born. This afternoon, I'd like to consider the origins and trajectory of more traditional broadcasting on the island of Ireland. I'll address how partisan politics, cultural prejudice, and outright censorship impacted official broadcasting as these services were emerging as tremendously influential sources of news and information. Politics, bias, and different forms of censorship were at work long before the outbreak of the Troubles and have influenced Irish broadcasting throughout the 20th century. Examining how radio and television was shaped in Ireland's contested political, social, and cultural environment provides insight into the turbulent history of 20th century Ireland. So I'll start with wireless or radio. Wireless or radio broadcasting stations in Dublin and Belfast were established in the 1920s and in many ways projected the dominant ideologies of their respective states. What became Radio Éireann and BBC Northern Ireland began transmitting in the wake of devastating political violence that shaped the states established on both sides of the border. The broadcasting service in Dublin and Belfast developed as conservative, inward-looking institutions that promoted deference to governments desperately searching for stability and legitimacy. Both stations were heavily influenced by political authorities, anxious to present their respective states as not only stable, but as distinct, one uniquely Gaelic, the other defiantly British. For decades, broadcasting officials in both jurisdictions practiced a remarkable degree of self-censorship, as each was careful to avoid any degree of controversy with religious, cultural, or especially political elites. A place to start charting a more traditional account of broadcasting in what would become the Republic of Ireland would be to address the short political career of James Joseph Walsh. Let's see if we have Walsh here. No. There's Walsh along with Cosgrave, Blythe, and O'Higgins. Walsh is on the far right. Walsh was an ardent and somewhat eccentric Republican from Bandon, West Cork, who had a keen interest in wireless broadcasting. Like many of his generation, he was drawn to the political separatism of Sinn Féin and to the Gaelic revival. Walsh joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1913 and helped organize the volunteers in Cork City. He earned a reputation as an excitable revolutionary who was sometimes incapable of controlling his unbridled enthusiasm for the cause. Walsh once famously declared, quote, "The day an Irish Republic was formed, the landlords would be put up against the wall, and there would be an end to landlordism for once and for all." He worked for the post office in Cork as a telegraph operator, but was dismissed for his radical politics that his supervisors found unsettling. Walsh made his way to Dublin, where he became an active participant in the Easter Rising. In fact, he was in the GPO during the rebellion. He knew Fergus O'Kelly and at one point helped O'Kelly and his colleagues with a radio transmitter when it was moved from the broadcasting school to the GPO. Walsh wrote about his participation in the Rising in his autobiography, Recollections of a Rebel. He recalled how once the rebellion started, he realized that authorities had not occupied the center of telephone communications in the city, located near Dublin Castle. A man who never missed an opportunity to stress his own importance, Walsh recounted that, quote, "Without instruction, I proceeded to exploit the possibilities of telegraphic contacts. Representing myself as Superintendent X, I had no difficulty in getting in touch with overseers in Cork, Limerick, Galway, and Wexford. In this way, Connolly, Pearce, and their associates knew how matters stood throughout the country." Walsh does not reveal if he explained to the rebel leaders that Dublin was alone, that no other city had risen, and that the rebellion was doomed. James Joseph Walsh was sentenced to the firing squad for taking up arms against the king, but his sentence was later commuted to penal servitude. He later became a prominent figure in Cumann na Gael and was appointed to a cabinet position, becoming the Irish Free State's first Postmaster General. As was the case in Britain, in the Irish Free State, the Post Office was charged with overseeing the establishment of an Indigenous radio service. Tasked by the Dáil with determining how radio should be set up, Walsh unilaterally decided that it was best to follow the model of the newly formed British Broadcasting Company. Walsh therefore decided to organize what he defined as the Irish Broadcasting Company, or the IBC. On his own initiative, and to the consternation of many Dáil deputies, he placed advertisements in the national press in the summer of 1923, requesting parties interested in being part of the IBC to contact him and his department. Walsh then introduced to the Dáil a white paper on broadcasting that addressed the challenges that confronted the government in establishing a broadcast station. He claimed to have thoroughly examined British and American models, declaring, quote, "In America and elsewhere, where broadcasting has been conducted as a private enterprise, a multiplicity of companies has been found to lead to chaos and confusion and to inefficient service." Believing that the licensing of dozens of stations in the United States had created a hectic, incoherent landscape for the medium, he was convinced that following the American model would cause untold headaches for him and his department. Looking to London and the recently established BBC, he explained that he wanted to bring together a number of private Irish companies involved in broadcasting to form a consortium that would be licensed by his department. A short time later, he abruptly announced that he had negotiated an agreement with a number of Irish companies to, quote, "work a system of broadcasting under license from the Post Office." Now, the tactics of the Postmaster General provoked a hostile reaction from Dáil deputies, who were stunned by the news and speed of Walsh's decisions. Many believed that the new medium of radio had tremendous potential and should not be operated as a commercial enterprise. Much to the chagrin of Walsh, the Doyle established the Special Committee on Wireless Broadcasting to consider his white paper and to methodically explore how radio should be introduced to the Irish Free State. The committee took its time and called dozens of witnesses before issuing an exhaustive 600-page report that firmly rejected the central thesis of the Postmaster General's plan. The special committee maintained that radio had enormous potential and argued it was simply too important to be entrusted to a private consortium, even if that consortium was licensed and overseen by the post office. Doyle deputies determined that radio should do more than simply entertain listeners, maintaining that it should also inform, educate, and uplift its audience with serious programming. To the intense irritation of the Postmaster General, the committee recommended that in order to protect this important national asset, radio should be established and run by Walsh's department, the Post Office. The Cumann na Gael government accepted the recommendations of the special committee and instructed Walsh to make arrangements for the establishing of a national radio service. The decision did not go down well with the volatile Postmaster General, who still believed that his own proposal was an excellent one and would be the best for his department as well as for the country. He denounced the committee's conclusion and argued strenuously that the post office was ill-suited to oversee a national radio service. Walsh was also concerned that politicians would interfere and try to exploit radio for their own political advantage. He angrily challenged his colleagues in the Dáil, quote, "If this House determines that the post office must differentiate between rival organ grinders, rival tenors, and people of that kind, and even rival politicians who want to control and get preferential treatment, we will be able to do it, but at a very dear price." So again, Walsh was not happy with the decision that had been made and didn't see himself that as a person that should be responsible for organizing programs that might entertain as well as uplift the nation. But his decision has been made, and Walsh reluctantly accepted responsibility for establishing the Irish Free State's radio service, which was initially designated 2RN. Walsh left politics a short time later, disillusioned with W.T. Cosgrave's government and upset that his proposal for an Irish broadcasting company had been rejected. Before resigning, he warned 2RN's first director that it would, quote, "be safe to steer clear as far as possible from religion and politics." Successive broadcasting officials took up this advice over the next 4 decades, and the result was that Irish radio failed to evolve as a popular service and failed to develop professional news and current affairs programming that addressed critical political, religious, or social issues. From the outset, the station embraced the conservative ethos of the Irish Free State and supported the insular rhetoric of the Gaelic revival. The co-founder of the Gaelic League and future president of Ireland, Douglas Hyde, delivered the inaugural address at the opening of the new station in January 1926. His choice as speaker highlights the cultural imperative of the Irish Free State. Hyde's words capture the sense of anxiety, and one could argue bias, shared by many cultural nationalists concerning the future of the native language in the fledgling Irish Free State. Hyde welcomed the opportunity that the new technology offered the nation and warned in graphic terms that foreign influence threatened ruin. Quote, "There were 2 tides in Ireland, one of them coming in on this side of Ireland and the other going out on the west coast. The tide of Gaelic was ebbing there and leaving behind a bare, cold, ugly beach in its wake. The fine Gaelic water had ebbed away and was replaced by the mud, slime, and filth of English." The Irish service operated on a shoestring budget, but slowly started to expand its reach. A second station opened in Cork in 1927, and Radio Éireann covered most of the country when a new transmitter was built in the Midlands along the River Shannon in 1932. Its autonomy, and many would argue its creativity was constrained by being part of the Department of Post and Telegraphs and its staffing by civil servants for over 30 years. In its formative years, Radio Éireann was starved of funds and depended on the Department of Finance for support. And in its formative years, Ernest Blythe was the Secretary or the Minister of Finance and looked at Radio Éireann with a great degree of scorn. He was able to siphon off revenue that was supposed to go to the radio service for the general budget. Again, finance was a department that was unimpressed with the needs of radio, believing that there were more compelling priorities to which the new state should attend. When Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932, a modest effort was made to improve the service. A new director, T.J. Kernan, was appointed, and by 1937, the number of listeners exceeded over 100,000. Under Kernan, a number of new initiatives were begun, with an increase in outside broadcasts and greater coverage of GAA games. The Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, recognized radio as an important resource and exploited it successfully on a number of occasions. His St. Patrick's Day address, The Ireland That We Dreamed Of, broadcast in 1943, is perhaps his best known and most often quoted speech. At the conclusion of the Second World War, de Valera again took to the airwaves to respond forcefully, and many believed with great dignity, to Winston Churchill's scathing denunciation of Ireland's policy of neutrality. Over time, efforts were made to develop new programming that would be more appealing to listeners, but such initiatives met with mixed results. Irish language broadcasts moved on from being didactic lessons in the language to commission short plays in an effort to build new audiences. However, confidential surveys carried out by Radio Éireann made it clear that very few listeners were turning into these broadcasts. Controversy remained almost non-existent on Ireland's national radio service, since the civil servants who staffed the station were not interested in developing programming that addressed complex political, religious, or social issues. Officials in Radio Éireann were keen to avoid conflict. Any inadvertent political or religious tension that emerged was handled quietly behind the scenes by civil servants who avoided ruffling any political or ecclesiastical feathers. The Secretary of the Department of Post and Telegraphs was Lon O'Brien, and he quietly mediated the infrequent tensions that developed between Radio Éireann and political or ecclesiastical elites. This form of self-censorship characterized Ireland's broadcasting service for decades. There's Douglas Hyde, and of course Lon O'Brien. Although Radio Éireann became part of the social and cultural landscape of Ireland, it remained a prisoner of the civil service. Critics of Radio Éireann argued that it lacked the imagination to engage listeners in a meaningful way. This careful conservatism and informal censorship shaped Ireland's broadcasting service from its very inception. When the Broadcasting Act was passed in 1960, creating an independent, though government-appointed, public authority to supervise broadcasting, this dynamic began to change. The Republic of Ireland was one of the last countries in Europe to establish an indigenous television service. This did not mean that this does not mean that Ireland was the last country to have access to television, as BBC broadcasts from Britain, as well as from Northern Ireland, could be received in parts of the country. Telefís Éireann, the native service, began broadcasting as a commercial public service on New Year's Eve 1961. The new television service caused tremendous consternation for Fianna Fáil governments in its first decade of broadcasting. This was especially true of news and current affairs programming. This type of programming provoked controversy on a number of occasions. Programs that questioned the tactics, decisions, and policies of the Lemass and Lynch governments provoked the outrage of many politicians who were wholly unaccustomed to being challenged by brash young men and women who were determined to use the medium to hold politicians accountable. Sean Lemass, here he is often regarded as Ireland's great modernizer. He learned to his chagrin that the television service established under his watch could create major political headaches. He famously defined television as, quote, an instrument of public policy, suggesting that it was an arm of the government, which it most certainly was not. His menacing statement highlights the frustration of a politician realizing that the modernization he encouraged to boost the economy and stem immigration meant the emergence of a new type of broadcast media that would not defer to the political establishment. And again, Lemass became increasingly frustrated with Televisión throughout the 1960s, believing that it should promote the government policies that his government was putting forward. Throughout the 1960s, a series of incidents provoked the wrath of powerful elites in Irish society. Gay Byrne deserves much of the credit for his uncanny ability to address taboo subjects on both television as well as on his popular daytime radio program. Again, Gay Byrne is always seen as one of these key mediators, and his Late Late Show is regarded as having helped open up Irish society. And he was an impressive mediator. He provided a popular and accessible forum for a discussion of a wide range of controversial topics. His programs definitely handled discussions about sensitive issues, including clerical celibacy, domestic violence, infanticide, alcoholism, and discrimination against traveling people. He also helped to promote debate about the role of women in Irish society and provided an important forum for the Irish women's liberation movement in the early 1970s. However, RT's contribution to the modernization of Irish society was not simply Byrne's handiwork. A range of editors, producers, managers, and writers developed a sophisticated broadcasting culture that enhanced Irish life. Although news and current affairs broadcasting helped open up Irish society, RTE could still suffer punishment at the hands of the government. This was the case when 7 Days emerged as a popular current affairs program that became a thorn in the side of the Fianna Fáil government. By 1969, the tension between RTE and the government had come to a head. A series of current affairs programs outraged the government for questioning the wisdom of decisions made by ministers. When the current affairs program 7 Days featured a show about illegal money lending or loan sharking in Dublin's inner city, a crisis ensued. The program implied that the police were not doing their job in protecting an insidious criminal element that preyed upon Dublin's poor. The Department of Justice was incensed, and Jack Lynch's government set up a tribunal that put Ireland's public service broadcasting station through the proverbial ringer. The tribunal lasted 51 days, called 133 witnesses, and cost taxpayers a very hefty £250 before issuing a verdict that was heavily critical of the program's research and conclusions. A few years later, the government interfered in broadcast. The government's interference in broadcasting became even more damaging due to a decision by the Lynch government to fire the entire government-appointed broadcasting authority for broadcasting material defined as seditious. Asked by the press if dismissing the RT authority might provide critics with ample reason to complain that he had nothing but contempt for the right of free speech, the Taoiseach replied simply, "Fuck them." As the violence of the Troubles unfolded, the Irish government did not hesitate to introduce draconian censorship. The implementation of formal censorship under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, again, forbade the transmission of material that was deemed to be subversive. Now to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's first radio station began broadcasting in 1924. When a royal charter formally established the BBC, in 1927, the Belfast station was incorporated into what became BBC Northern Ireland. In its formative years, BBC Northern Ireland relayed the national programme produced from London and only slowly began to develop programming of its own. From the outset, broadcasting in Northern Ireland was strongly influenced by the uneven power structure characterising life in the province. Officials in BBC, in Broadcasting House here in Belfast, embraced unionist domination of political life and proved remarkably deferential to the powerful political establishment. In these circumstances, many Catholics simply regarded BBC Northern Ireland as a medium dominated by unionists and were inclined to try and tune in Radio Éireann for news and entertainment. Until the appointment of Waldo Maguire in 1965, directors or controllers of the BBC at Broadcasting House came from outside of Northern Ireland. On arrival, they were quickly accepted into the unionist community and schooled into the peculiarities of life in a deeply divided society. Many became very comfortable in Belfast, including George Beadle, an Englishman who arrived in Northern Ireland in 1926 after setting up a radio service for the BBC in Durban, South Africa. He quickly adapted to his new home in Belfast, becoming one of the power brokers of the unionist establishment and setting a precedent for subsequent directors or controllers of the BBC Northern Ireland. These men were welcomed into Belfast's exclusive Ulster Reform Club, dominated by the great and good of Northern Ireland. There, broadcasting officials enjoyed dinners, drinks, billiards, and card games with leading unionist politicians and businessmen. Beadle became so embedded in the unionist establishment of Belfast that he wrote to the BBC managing director in London, suggesting BBC Northern Ireland should make it official and become the voice of Stormont. He proclaimed, quote, "I am sure that our position here will be strengthened immensely if we can persuade the Northern government to look upon us as their mouthpiece." This suggests a certain degree of bias that permeated Broadcasting House. BBC Northern Ireland defined itself as decidedly British, and senior staff underscored this on a number of occasions. Directors of BBC Northern Ireland made it quite clear that they regarded Northern Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom, and to that end, they worked diligently to maintain a British facade for the province. Senior staff did not tolerate any reference to divisions within Northern society, and directors insisted that broadcasting officials in Belfast and London present Northern Ireland as a loyal Protestant province. Programs that originated in London that stumbled into the minefield of Irish history or suggested that there was a disaffected minority in Northern Ireland provoked outrage. At times, the BBC in Belfast appeared more zealously unionist than unionist politicians at Stormont, as when director George Marshall bizarrely attacked London's network program titled The Irish. This particular broadcast originated in London, but was transmitted throughout the United Kingdom. Because it addressed life on both sides of the border, Marshall wrote to London to protest both the title and the content of the program. He chastised London on the grounds that the title was, quote, highly undesirable, arguing that it linked, quote, under one name, two strongly antipathetic states with completely different political outlooks. London was told, quote, there is no such thing today as an Irishman. One is either a citizen of the Irish Free State or a citizen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Irishmen ceased to exist after partition. After the war, London decided that broadcasting should be decentralized and advocated increased autonomy for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Although the BBC in London hoped to encourage regional broadcasting and substantial autonomy for each nation of the United Kingdom, unionists in Belfast were alarmed. Many, including the Prime Minister, were profoundly concerned that regional programming would mean a severed connection with Britain. They also feared that autonomy would mean nationalists would become directly involved in broadcasting, and were worried that this would inevitably touch upon divisions within Northern Ireland. Andrew Stewart, who became the regional director of the Belfast station in 1948, took the unusual step of attending a cabinet meeting at Stormont to urge ministers to reject the autonomy on offer. He warned the cabinet that involving the nationalist community in broadcasting decisions would be a grave mistake, maintaining that it would lead to discord, acrimony, and ultimately embarrassment for the Stormont Parliament. In the end, ministers agreed and rejected London's offer of autonomy. Unionists determination to cultivate and protect a British image for Northern Ireland meant that devolution simply could not be tolerated. Although unionists remained sensitive to any perceived slight from broadcasters, some in Broadcasting House in Belfast sought to carefully develop more inclusive regional broadcasts in the post-war period. And this has been pointed out by Jill McIntosh, who many of you might know. She demonstrates that Broadcasting House in Belfast tried to create an Ulster identity, all the while not undermining its Britishness. Talented Ulster writers, including Sam Hannah-Bell, W.R. Rogers, and John Hewitt, were recruited to produce material for listeners that would reflect on life inside of Northern Ireland. While these initiatives were intended to carefully make the service more inclusive, most nationalists continue to view the BBC here in Northern Ireland as overly sympathetic to the unionist community and much too focused on representing a culture that was simply not their own. BBC Northern Ireland continued to marginalise the nationalist community and its culture, and remained determined that the image of Northern Ireland presented to the outside world would be a British one. Management remained wary of upsetting the union's establishment and continued to show a remarkable degree of deference to its political sensibilities. The station employed few Catholics and featured little cultural programming that could be defined as Gaelic or Irish. Prejudice, self-censorship, and a form of political and cultural bias characterized the Northern Ireland branch of the United Kingdom's prestigious public broadcasting service. Television would change things. Much like in the Republic, television had a profound effect on politics and society in Northern Ireland. Now, comparing BBC Northern Ireland and its television station and RTE is problematic for a number of reasons. It needs to be emphasized that the regional television service at Broadcasting House here in Belfast was a very small operation. BBC Television began broadcasting in 1953. In fact, its first broadcast was timed to coincide with the coronation of Elizabeth II. In the 1960s, BBC Northern Ireland's news and current affairs staff included only a handful of individuals who typically did not work weekends. They operated with a limited budget and produced only a couple of hours a week of programming. Until the outbreak of the Troubles in 1968 or 1969, the BBC in Northern Ireland existed in a veritable cocoon, with London tending to ignore Northern Ireland and regarding the BBC Northern Ireland service as the Siberia of the BBC. Up until the outbreak of the Troubles, one could argue that BBC Northern Ireland remained incredibly deferential to the unionist establishment. But this began to change in the late 1960s and early 1970s as a number of key figures found a middle ground inside the regional service. I mentioned Waldo Maguire before. He was appointed as controller in 1965 and was the first person from Northern Ireland to hold that post. He was controller when the troubles erupted, and lasted until he was forced into an early retirement after suffering a stroke in 1972. Again, you can imagine the stress that this man was under, and it affected his health. He ended up taking early retirement because of a stroke that was most likely caused by the stress that he was under in this position. In London, Maguire was regarded as a liberal, a controller that could change the insular culture of the regional service. Politically, Maguire supported the reforms of Terence O'Neill and hoped his moderate policies would succeed. But Maguire remained a cautious controller, famously insisting that televised reports of the outbreak of unrest in August 1969 should be sanitized. His decision, again, to try and control how the outbreak of violence in August 1969 was reported, upset many younger colleagues, including Martin Bell, who would write about the fact that he and his colleagues were not permitted to identify who was attacking whom when fierce sectarian rioting broke out here in Belfast. Many younger, more aggressive journalists tended to regard Maguire as too cautious, and they believed his policies were simply censorship. These journalists were anxious to ask awkward questions about the roots of a divided society and a dysfunctional local government. They were not afraid to criticize how the police and army responded to the mayhem that ensued throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Within the BBC at Broadcasting House, a number of senior figures, including Dick Francis, Robin Walsh, and Cecil Taylor, emerged as courageous public servants as the violence escalated. Richard Francis became controller after Maguire retired and worked with a number of talented journalists, many from London, to offer compelling news and current affairs programming that delved deep into the mayhem of the 1970s and 1980s. Again, many of these journalists, with the support of their managers and editors, were interested in finding out why Catholics were alienated, why the extremes from both communities had so much support. These managers, editors, and journalists changed the passive culture that had characterized the regional service, especially in its news and current affairs programming. This is a photograph of the opening of BBC in 1953, of the coronation celebration. Richard Francis, the man that I mentioned before, he emerged as controller after Walter Maguire's early retirement. Francis was not from Ireland or Northern Ireland. He was from Yorkshire. And he was an incredibly courageous controller, somebody that protected his journalists. As controller, he found himself under tremendous pressure, both from the Northern Ireland office here and also from politicians in London. Many believed that the broadcasts of the BBC were undermining the efforts of the security services. This is Francis emerging from Broadcasting House after the IRA set off a car bomb at its front door. As the violence escalated, the reporting that came out of Northern Ireland, especially by the BBC, unnerved the British government by questioning the policies, tactics, and decisions of those in authority. Civil, political, and military leaders reacted with fury to reporting that maintained that heavy-handed British policies were alienating the Catholic community and might even be encouraging the minority to support the IRA. A 1976 confrontation between this man, Roy Mason, seen here on the right, and senior BBC officials in Belfast underscored this fraught relationship that lasted throughout the 70s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. Shortly after arriving in his post, Mason traveled to Belfast, and the newly appointed Secretary of State for Northern Ireland forcefully attacked the BBC, arguing that television coverage of the unrest inflamed the violence. Mason denounced the BBC Board of Governors and senior editors and managerial staff who had traveled from London to Belfast at a dinner that had been arranged to welcome him at the elegant Culloden Hotel. During what one observer defined as the Second Battle of Culloden, Mason condemned the work of the BBC as irresponsible and called for the imposition of formal censorship. The new Secretary of State declared to the assembled governors and officials that broadcasting was undermining, the television broadcasting of the BBC was undermining the work of the security services, and described the BBC coverage as appalling. He threatened to cut off funding and punish the institution by making unspecified changes to its charter. So again, Roy Mason, as Secretary of State, came, of course, from a Labour background, and he regarded the BBC as too close to the IRA. He believed that its broadcasts were undermining the efforts of the police as well as the army. The veteran BBC correspondent Martin Dillon recently published a memoir, a book that accused BBC Northern Ireland of anti-Catholic biases throughout the 1970s and 1980s. maintaining that senior management was insensitive to the minority community. Dylan's book has just come out. He recalls that when he arrived at Broadcasting House as a young reporter, it was standard practice for officials in Broadcasting House to host parties for unionist politicians on the 12th of July, and that they watched from the 6th floor of Broadcasting House as parades marched by the Ormeau Avenue building. Dylan would single out the controller of BBC Northern Ireland at the time, James Hawthorne, for particular criticism, stating that he was summoned to Hawthorne's office and told that his coverage of unionist opposition to the 1985 Anglo-Irish Act was unacceptable. According to Dylan, Hawthorne warned, quote, "I should not forget that I was employed by the British Broadcasting Corporation, and that without issuing an edict, he was in effect telling me in an underhanded way to get in line with British policy." Now, Hawthorne is a fascinating character. He would replace the controller with Richard Francis, who would move back to London. Hawthorne was a Northerner who served a decade as controller after being appointed to the post in 1988. He described himself as a unionist, although he maintained that his own political preference did not influence his editorial judgment. Dylan's description of this encounter with the controller obviously undermines Hawthorne's claim. But Hawthorne was not a puppet of the establishment, and there's no evidence that he was being directed by his superiors to try and curtail coverage of unionist opposition to the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement. It was more likely his own frustration to that opposition and unease with the coverage that prompted him to criticize Dylan. This past week, I've been at the BBC Written Archives, which are at Caversham, which is just outside of Reading, and been looking at Hawthorne's papers. And he is a fascinating character. He's somebody that is, a unionist, but he believes that his own politics don't have any really effect on his editorial judgment. Indeed, Hawthorne's decision as controller often infuriated political elites in Belfast and in London, as the programs he supported incurred the wrath of unionists as well as Labour and Tory politicians alike. Hawthorne's first encounter with the Secretary of State, Roy Mason, underscored this hostility. After taking up his position as controller, Hawthorne was summoned to meet the Secretary at what was described would be an informal and very friendly pub lunch. Over what he described as a grueling 2.5 hours, he listened to Mason as he launched into a blistering attack on the integrity of the BBC. Mason accused Hawthorne and the BBC of constantly stirring things up, noting that the BBC in Northern Ireland were, quote, bad enough, but the London BBC was totally irresponsible. Hawthorne quoted Mason as exclaiming, quote, "They don't care about Northern Ireland, about soldiers, young soldiers being maimed and killed. Journalists who want to simply make a name for themselves in Northern Ireland don't give a damn about the trouble they inflict." Hawthorne was threatened by Mason, who informed him that there was a new cross-party consensus that had emerged at Westminster, and that a decision had been made by Tories as well as Labour MPs alike to punish the BBC for its transgressions. Hawthorne was told, quote, "You've joined the BBC, Jimmy boy, and it's just about to crack. Bloody gentlemen of the BBC think they are above criticism. Ari Neve and Margaret Thatcher have come to see me, and we're absolutely agreed that there should be no increase in your license unless you put things right." Concluding, de Gaulle knew how to handle the media. Mason was convinced that there were subversive elements intent on wreaking havoc in Northern Ireland, telling Hawthorne, quote, "There were Marxist and extreme socialist elements behind all of this." Margaret Thatcher, of course, shared Mason's antipathy towards the BBC and believed its programming undermined the work of the security services. She was always suspicious of the BBC and believed strongly that it had a left-wing bias, that opposed the Tories and their policies. The Prime Minister introduced formal censorship in 1988 by bringing the infamous broadcasting ban into fruition. But her efforts to deny the IRA the oxygen of publicity were ultimately unsuccessful, only highlighting the tenacity of her enemies, and many would argue the contempt she felt for the freedom of the press. By the 1960s, television had begun to undermine the parochialism that had characterized broadcasting in both the Irish Republic as well as Northern Ireland. Once a Broadcasting Act was passed by the Irish government, RTÉ television developed cutting-edge news and current affairs programming that placed tremendous pressure on Fianna Fáil and later Fine Gael-led governments. While reporting on the Troubles was censored, RTÉ continued to feature aggressive programming that was critical of government policy on a range of issues. In Northern Ireland, Martin Dillon's story of discrimination and bias at the BBC in Belfast is really not surprising. Dillon no doubt witnessed bias and discrimination because this was part of life in Northern Ireland, and the regional broadcasting service was certainly not immune from it. But this dynamic had begun to change inside of Broadcasting House, especially in the late 1960s, as a number of intrepid managers, editors, journalists, and others challenged the narrative governments in Belfast and London were keen to promote. Formal censorship ended both in the Irish Republic and in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland as the peace process of the late 1990s took hold. But formal or informal censorship proved a shared experience in both jurisdictions throughout the 20th century. Thank you.